Good afternoon. Welcome to the SQAB tutorials for ABA and SQABites. Those of you who saw the last talk saw a lovely natural bridge at the end of it in Utah. I presume it was Tim that showed it. That's the theme of what we're doing here today. It's attempting to take behavioral concepts that may seem esoteric from afar and bring them to an audience that we feel would benefit in what they do from knowing about it. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce today a person who fills that role exceptionally well, both in what he's going to discuss and what he is. The talk by Tim Shahan underscored the critical importance of understanding conditioned reinforcers and being able to predict choice behavior and resistance to change. It's something you thought we would have had accomplished by now, but we're just learning new ways to think about what we're doing, perhaps more accurate as we go. Tim also mentioned that he found the Miller and Associates models a little difficult to comprehend. And I was so glad I turned to Jim Mazer on my side and said, you know, at my age, you're always sort of checking yourself. And I found them difficult too. So I'm glad that young whippersnapper, Tim Shahan, had some difficulty with it. So we're not alone. And one of the great things I look forward to this afternoon is getting it from one of the horse's mouths, getting it from Steve Stout, who has mastered the associative conditioning literature, and in particular that of Ralph Miller and Associates, one of the richest in the field today. Cue competition is extremely important. What happens all the time, even more so if we believe that the role of conditioned reinforcers is in guiding behavior as much as in reinforcing. And the understanding of cues and how they interact can't be done without the kind of experiments that Steve will talk to you about today. Dr. Stout comes to us from being a graduate student in Mauricio Papini's lab, where Mauricio is much closer to animal learning and cognition, animal learning and behavior than many of us. So already that's one arrow in the quiver of Dr. Stout's competencies. From there he went to work as a graduate student, as a postdoc with Ralph Miller, and learned that complex skills that I went to England to study with Tony Dickinson about and came away not knowing a lot more. We're going to learn more today, I'm sure. And he's a behaviorist in the sense that all of us can embrace in terms of understanding Skinnerian and Hoffman terminology. Finally, in his own life, he turned to a local community school where there were problems with kids that had learning challenges, and said, well, I can do somewhat better here, maybe. Let me try and see what I can do. He's not going to talk to you today about this very much, but you should buttonhole him if you're an applied behavior analyst and want to talk about the pragmatic of using some of the things he's doing in situations that many of you are familiar with. Finally, you may not know, Steve Stout's an expert soccer player. And by soccer, I mean, of course, sometimes competing retrieval theory of behavior. I was attempting to model some of my complex behavior recently, and I wanted to try some competing theory. I did a half dozen of them. And the one that came out almost as good as mine, head and shoulders above the others, was one that I would not have understood if I had not read the Psych Review article that Steve and Ralph Miller published 4 years ago now, which is an excellent introduction to a nice, simple, as it goes, formalization of sometimes. So Steve has done a lot of things. He's done the panoply of animal learning and behavior work. He's done applied work well. He's done theoretical work, and he's done translation of theoretical work to audiences that can appreciate it. So I think it's going to be a great talk this afternoon. I'm glad I'm here for it, and that you're here for it to share it with me also. Steve?
Thank you, Peter. Can everyone hear me? Okay, my talk's divided into 3 sections today. The first section is, what is Pavlovian conditioning, and why is this talk in a SQAB tutorial? The second section will be called simple conditioning and contingency, and the third section that I hope to cover is cue interaction. So, first section, what is Pavlovian conditioning, and why is this talk in a SQAB tutorial? Well, on the way over, haven't flown, I guess I'll hate to admit, in a couple of years, and I had forgotten one of the things that happens when you fly in a plane. You take off, and there's usually not any clouds at the ground level. And in this case, there's a bank of clouds just above the plane, and we start to approach the bank of clouds, and as soon as we go through it, I can feel the plane shake. And don't enjoy that very much. You go through that bank of clouds, and then you start to approach another cloud, and the plane begins to shake again. You do this several times, and you realize what clouds signal turbulence. And as you approach the clouds, you start to tense up a bit. And that's an example of Pavlovian conditioning, or what some people call respondent conditioning, or classical conditioning. You probably know the drill here. You have a shaking airplane. This causes you to tense your stomach. Various behavioral reactions occur. Those are the unconditioned responses. The shaking of the plane is the unconditioned stimulus. The approaching cloud is becomes paired with the shaking of the airplane, leads to tensing on its own. And of course, the tensing now elicited by the approaching cloud is, we give the name a conditioned response. And the approaching cloud itself is called a conditioned stimulus. Pretty straightforward stuff. We can define Pavlovian conditioning in the abstract by saying that it's behavioral change in the presence of a stimulus event produced by the experienced temporal relationship of one of those stimuli, S1, and at least one other stimulus event, which we could call S2. In other words, conditioning is produced by pairing stimuli. And in a lot of operant psychology, we're not interested in that relationship. We're interested in the relationship between responses and stimuli, usually responses and reinforcers, or responses and punishers. But at the same time, anytime that you are pairing a response and a reinforcer, there's also discriminative stimuli in the situation, and those are being paired with the reinforcer. If you're pairing a response with a punisher, the discriminative stimuli in the situation are also being directly paired themselves with the punisher. And so anytime you see operant conditioning, you're probably also going to see Pavlovian conditioning. The Pavlovian conditioning probably gets grabbed by the contingencies, the operant contingencies, but it's always there. So for this reason, I think it's very important for behavior analysts, especially applied behavior analysts, to have some grasp of the study of Pavlovian conditioning. Now, these stimulus events in the laboratory have discrete onsets and offsets. In the real world, events flow continuously. We know that events usually are not discrete, so the clouds are an example of a continuous flow. It's a very common occurrence, Pavlovian conditioning is. There are any number of different conditioned responses. I just generated this kind of from memory. The first few here, freezing, approach, taste preference, taste aversion, blinking, are common laboratory preparations for the study of Pavlovian conditioning, but we have many others. Pavlov was famous for studying salivation. Heart rate can be conditioned, blood pressure, sneezing of all things. People have shown before that folks will sneeze to fake roses, plastic roses, as a conditioned response to their previous pairing of the rose with the pollen. Illness can be conditioned to immune system activity, levels of insulin. Anytime you smell donuts, or my favorite example is in the mall there are these Cinnabon shops, and they have this incredible smell of cinnamon rolls, and of course your pancreas releases all kinds of insulin in response to that. That's a conditioned response. Fetishes, phobias, galvanic skin response, drug tolerance, drug withdrawal. Lots of nice work by Shep Siegel on that. Showing that these very basic, what would seem to be medical conditions, are actually conditioned responses, sometimes drug highs. Statements that people make about causal efficacy, whether something causes something else, or statements about the likelihood of occurrence of an event, obey the same laws of Pavlovian conditioning that we're going to talk about. Pupillary reflexes, nausea, diuresis, knee-jerk responses, swallowing, eye tracking, vocal pitch, and adjunctive behaviors. And we could keep going. You know, there are lots and lots of Pavlovian responses. In a lay sense, Pavlovian conditioning is the study of anticipation, as Dr. Frankenfurter put it so well in the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Before I talk about the conditioning itself, I want to do a little background. And what I've drawn here is what I call a weak phylogeny of learning psychologists. This doesn't include everyone in history, but essentially I see, and having been in these three different areas myself, I'm not particularly good at any of them, But I've been able to see that there are these different streams of learning psychology. And going all the way back to our forefather here, Thorndike, who in 1898 had his dissertation kind of started the experimental study of learning psychology. Somewhere along the way, Watson decided that any sort of mentalism was undesirable and led to a really strongly positivistic stream that included Skinner and eventually became what we today call the experimental analysis of behavior. Meanwhile, folks who were a little more liberal with their admission of theoretical constructs called neo-behaviorists kind of continued a stream that today I think you could call associative learning. So people like Rescorla and Wagner would be in that category today. And somewhere along the way, the experimental analysis stream saw necessary to break into two parts, one leading to the what we call today applied behavior analysis. Now today we have these three different areas that continue to split from each other. They have their own outlets. So some journals in associative learning. There are journals that publish experimental analysis of behavior. And there's some journals, bump something here. Okay, there's some journals that publish applied behavior analysis research. There's a bit of overlap, but increasingly there's less and less, and that's a natural progression in science. Science has become more and more specialized. But what we have today is a situation where increasingly the applied behavior analysts aren't communicating with the experimental analysts. The experimental analysts aren't communicating with the applied behavior analysts. And the associative learners over here on the, I guess on the left, they're not communicating as much as they used to with the experimental analysts. And there's almost no interaction between these two groups at all. And one nice thing about this video series, this tutorial series, is that it allows folks from the different areas to have input with each other. And I think it's a really nice thing that we're doing here. Our progenitor, if you've read the papers lately, there's this, I guess, a lemur-like creature called Ida. We could trace our roots back. Common forefather here is Thorndike, who we could call today Ida. Now, before getting into the actual conditioning itself, I wanted to walk you through a Mickey Mouse philosophy of science. So this isn't the kind of a thing that a philosopher of science would be happy with. This is spending maybe 20 or 30 minutes thinking about different classes of scientific statements. I think science is making statements about the world. That's really all it is. And we do that all the time naturally. But then we do something special in science that we don't do in our lay lives, and that is we evaluate those statements along several different dimensions. I've listed a few here. Accuracy. Statements can be accurate, statements can be inaccurate. Most accurate statements that we can make sometimes are equations that make point predictions. Statements can vary in their parsimony, how complex they are, from less to greater complexity. Statements can vary in their fruitfulness. Do they lead to new research, or are they barren? Statements can vary in their scope. How many phenomena can your statement explain? How many phenomena can it predict or handle? Now, all of those are not necessarily correlated with each other positively. A lot of times a high accuracy statement is also low in scope and vice versa. And so it's hard to say which of these is the more important. But in general, we can note that each of these dimensions of explanation has a worse and a better end. Now, again, they're probably correlated dimensions. So presumably a theory, if you have two theories that are competing, the one of broader scope is going to be the one that's preferred. And so when we think about our statements about the world, we can say that they occupy a region in a hyperspace where we plot the dimensions at maybe orthogonal vectors to each other. There's some region of in space that your theory or your statement occupies. Hopefully, as we go through time in this field of behaviorism, behavior analysis, learning psychology, our theories or our statements about the world come to occupy better and better regions of in space, or this hyperspace. Now, there are, though, different areas in hyperspace or in space occupied by different classes of statements about the world, and I wanted to walk through those. Class 1 and this isn't meant to be any kind of dimension here, they're just kind of arbitrary numbers. Statements of observable relationships between classes of events without any constructs, as much as that might be possible. A lot of debate about the desirability of constructs in explanation, and the most radically behaviorist or positivistic folks would claim that this is the ideal class because there's really nothing in here that's not directly observable. Sometimes these statements are non-mathematical. Saying, for example, that conditioning is generally better when trials are spaced would be a class 1 statement. If you had a simple learning curve, a negatively accelerated learning curve drawn like this is a class 1 mathematical statement. Lambda represents a limit of conditioning. That can be seen directly in data. It's just the highest place that the conditioning goes to. Time is directly observable, measurable with a clock. And a base and a constant are just numbers. And the response rate can be observable directly. So we can make statements that describe behavior without any appeal to any constructs whatsoever. Okay, some people might argue that this is impossible, but it can occasionally be achieved, I think. Now we might go into another class here. This is class 2. Statements of observable relationships plus something. And what this something is called varies depending on who you read, but we'll use the term here, middle terms. Middle terms specified precisely by the antecedent and consequent events, which are themselves observable. Sometimes we find it necessary to postulate constructs like hunger or associative strength or something like that to mediate between inputs, antecedents, and outputs. Now, investigators who work in this class tend not to believe that the middle constructs, these middle terms, are actually real. They treat them as calculational fictions, which is a term someone used once. There are mathematical models in Class B, models that have inputs, they have outputs, but they also have stuff in the middle. The stuff in the middle is not directly observable. And here's an example that should be familiar to a lot of you. This is the Rescorla-Wagner model. I'm not going to walk through this. But in this model, as we saw in the last talk, we have a construct V, or associative strength, which is produced by some things that are directly observable, but the associative strength itself is not. We might make up a response rule, and here I've not specified a clean response rule. A response rule that might work off of that middle term. Now, the advantage of this kind of construct is that if I have some fun, or if the concept of associative strength works for me, I can play around with the equations to describe it differently, or the response equation to put it together differently, and not abandon the construct. But the construct itself is not directly observable. So those are two classes that I've worked in before. Third class of statements we might make are those observable relationships between environment and behavior, plus some underlying physiology as the middle term. And in this case, here's a reflex arc. The underlying physiology in that case is well known, and so when you walk through all the causal change, and they're really precisely described, these models actually become class 1 models because everything in the model is directly observable. And so we can see the sensory neuron, the motor fiber neuron fire. We can see it cause the effector muscle to contract and actually walk all the way from the environment, from the change in the environment to the change in the organism's behavior, straight through physiology. Now, there's one more class of explanation that is common today, and that's what I call class 4. These are statements of observable relationships plus something else. And here I'm going to be a little pejorative and say imprecisely specified middle terms. A lot of times when people work in this class, they believe that the middle term itself is the object of investigation. And so the difference is, do you see memory, for example, as a hypothetical construct that allows you to make some sense of delayed stimulus control, or do you believe that you're studying memory? Are you studying associative strength? Or are you studying what the animal's actually doing? Well, when we compare these three strains of learning that I started talking about, experimental analysis of behavior tends to stay in class 1, and sometimes, and I think increasingly, it's moving into class 2. So there are some constructs there, but they tend to be highly constrained. Applied behavior analysis, as it has come to be, is almost always non-mathematical class 1. I don't know of any exceptions to that. Associative learning, this tradition, tends to be class 2, class 3, and a lot of times class 4. And let me give you an example of a class 4 explanation of a simple behavioral phenomenon. Say that you pair sugar, you just mix up some Kool-Aid, cherry Kool-Aid, and you let rats drink the cherry Kool-Aid. They're going to associate, or you're putting together cherry and sugar, and you do that in 2 different groups. Then you split the animals into 2 separate groups, an experimental and a control. For the experimental group, you pair the sugar with lithium chloride, which is a poison. In the control group, you don't pair the 2, but you present them anyway. You're going to notice that the preference for cherry flavor is very low here because the sugar has been paired with the poison and the cherry was paired with the sugar. And subjects here aren't going to be particularly bothered by this because there's no chain back to the cherry. Now, how is this explained in associative learning? Well, we can make a couple of sentences about it. We could say the subject encodes a representation of the CS and a representation of the food US, and current responding somehow reflects the combined strength of the CS food association and the current hedonic valence of the US representation. And if you wanted to draw a graph of this, you could have from a sensory input here with the cherry drink is there's nodes in the brain or in the mind that light up when you have cherry. There's nodes that light up when you consume sugar. There's an association formed between those nodes. When you have poison, lithium chloride, there's a node there, and that somehow those 2 nodes compete so that the response doesn't come out well. Or you could say the following. Pairing food with poison reduces condition responding previously paired with that food. 2 sweet CSs that were previously paired with that food. Or more generally, CRs can be altered by treatment of the US. I think, unfortunately, in the associative learning tradition, statements like this aren't made commonly enough. There is so much obsession with this associative structure that sometimes folks, I think, have lost the forest for the trees. And yet there are lots of nice commonalities, lots of nice principles of behavior that come out of associative learning, and I don't think they're widely disseminated because the area becomes so very cognitive. Let's look at some simple conditioning and contingency to start out with. And what I want to do is try to share with you some of the, at least some simple things that are in conditioning research that might be profitable to behavior analysis. Let's look at a conditioning experiment. And one of the reasons that I was drawn to the study of Pavlovian conditioning is the excellent experimental control that you have in a conditioning experiment. You have time, which can move forward in discrete bins. And in any bin, a CS can occur or not. And an unconditioned stimulus can occur or not. And we can measure a conditioned response. It's a very simple procedure. And what you have, essentially, if you're looking at a single conditioned response, is an input matrix that can result in an output vector, what's called a matrix transformation. And the job of the conditioning researcher is to find what CS-US relationships, as you draw these zeros and ones in this state table, how they will cause the organism to respond in the response vector. And so it seems, at least in principle, to be a very simple thing to study. Well, that was my attraction to it. I now no longer believe that because it's a very complex, very, very complex field. And to date, we have no models that can actually do simple conditioning. As far as I know, there is not a single formal model of conditioning that can handle just simple conditioning. when you add in other time variables. If we were to increase the number of bins per time unit, we can start to represent intertrial intervals as completely empty spaces, and we can add complexity to this. There isn't at present a model that will allow you to put zeros and ones anywhere you want and get the appropriate response vector out. And it would seem like by this year, 2009, we would be there, but we're a long way from that. So let's talk about some basic variables that affect conditioning. Most basic one is the number of reinforced trials. The more trials you have, the more conditioning you see. Usually the curve is negatively accelerated. A lot of times, though, there's a pre-asymptote peak, and conditioning or condition responding tends to drop a little bit after it's hit a peak. A very powerful phenomenon that we observe in the acquisition of simple condition responding is that the ratio of the intertrial interval to the CS duration controls the rate of the emergence of condition responding. This was the great finding of Gibbon and Balsam. The time between trials is the intertrial interval. The duration of the CS is the time from the onset of the CS until the US is delivered. The further apart the trials are spaced, the faster conditioning is. The shorter the CSs are, the faster conditioning occurs. And an observation that's received a tremendous amount of attention over time is the contingency or the correlation between the CS and the US. So a way to quantify this contingency is with the contingency table. This comes right out of basic statistics. CSs can occur or not, and USs may occur or not. And so we have four possibilities. CSs and USs can be paired. The CS can occur without a US. The US can occur without a CS. And in cell D here, both things occur not at all. And so this represents the intertrial interval. Now, generally it's observed that cell A, the pairings of the CS and the US help conditioning. Intertrial intervals, as I said just a minute ago, there's no US, no CS together. That helps conditioning. And then the two things that harm conditioning are the CS and the US occurring apart from each other, which I've represented here with cells B and C. Both of those are harmful. Now, one thing I wanted to do with this talk is present an absolutely atheoretical presentation of conditioning phenomena. And let's look at some of these. One way to measure the contingency, or popular way to do it, has been the delta P rule, which is the probability of an unconditioned stimulus given a conditioned stimulus minus the probability of an unconditioned stimulus given no conditioned stimulus. This tells you how much more likely you are to see an unconditioned stimulus if a CS is there or if a signal is there than if it's not there. Another way to measure, much less used, is the phi correlation coefficient. However you measure the contingency between the CS and the US, the measured contingency tends to correlate with condition responding. Now, there are different ways you can break up a contingency between these two stimuli. Cell B and cell C trials, again, are those trials where the two occur apart from each other. Either you have USs without CSs or CSs without USs. And those trials, those harmful trials, can occur before, interspersed among, or after these cell A, these CS-US pairings. And so there are actually 6 possibilities here. Number 1, cell B trials occurring before cell A trials. These are non-reinforced CS presentations that precede CS-US pairings. We see a strong retardation of conditioning that's been called latent inhibition, or the CS pre-exposure effect. Second thing you can do, intersperse the cell B trials among the cell A trials. So you have non-reinforced CS presentations interspersed among CS-US presentations. This procedure is called partial reinforcement. And it too degrades acquisition and sometimes is seen to slow extinction. Now suppose that the cell B trials, the CS alone trials, occur after the CS-US pairings. This procedure is called extinction. And extinction has an extremely deleterious effect on condition responding. Now those are usually more familiar than these 3. Suppose that you present unconditioned stimuli, like the food apart from the bell and the food pairings. So you have the shaking apart from the clouds approaching you. The US occurs without the CS. That can also happen before, during, or after the pairings of the CS and the US. When we expose the subject to a US prior to CS-US pairings, we get something called the US pre-exposure effect, harms conditioning. When we intersperse the trials, we get something called the contingency degradation effect. This also harms conditioning. And when the US occurs by itself following the pairings, we have a not so robust effect called inflation that actually can be quite strong in humans sometimes. Now, I've covered six different cells of this matrix. There's CS pre-exposure, partial reinforcement, and extinction. Those are all involved with the CS being presented alone. There are 3 cells here with the US being presented by itself, US pre-exposure, degraded contingency, and inflation. And one thing you might ask yourself is, how do these compare to each other? What are the relatively stronger phenomena? And does it matter when you test the CS following these treatments? And the answer is, they can produce wildly different effects. And this magnitude of these effects can vary tremendously depending on when you test the CS, something I don't think is generally recognized. Here is, so I'm going to present some data from a test of just this top cell, this top line, these top 3 cells here, involving CSs apart from USs. And again, they can occur before the CS-US pairings, during the CS-US pairings, or after the CS-US pairings. And what we did in this experiment was we varied the time between the treatment of the subjects and the testing. And so if you look at the blue line here, this is an immediate test. Now this is an experiment of human predictive judgment. People saw they would sit down on the computer and they would see various geometric shapes, and occasionally a geometric shape would be followed by a really stupid picture of a baby making a face, which I should have put in the slide there. It was kind of an arresting picture. And either they saw the geometric shape before, and this is the latent inhibition condition, they saw all of those CS alone trials before the shape baby pairings, or they saw them interspersed among them, that's partial reinforcement, or they saw all of the shape alone trials after the CS-US pairings. Well, if you look at the immediate test, you get an ordering where this latent inhibition, this CS pre-exposure effect, is not very strong. The confidence that the baby would occur next was actually quite high, about 80%. Partial reinforcement is in the middle, and extinction harmed conditioning pretty decently. They were down to about 50%. However, if you delay the test for 48 hours, and this has been replicated in a number of situations, not just involving humans in predictive judgment, but also involving animals in basic conditioning situations, the reverse pattern occurs. Now, the extinction group gives you the best responding. This difference is what we typically call spontaneous recovery. The partial reinforcement group shows no change, and of all things, the latent inhibition, the CS pre-exposure group, responding drops tremendously. The effect strengthens with time, something that people today are calling super latent inhibition. CS pre-exposure the effect of that actually gets stronger with time. And what we're seeing here is akin to a phenomenon that people have looked at in the human memory literature. Ian Neath has done a lot of work on this, called the recency to primacy shift. That is, if you're testing people at a certain time, events that recently occurred control their behavior the most. But if you move them away from those original events that influenced them, the early events in the sequence tend to gain control over behavior. And that's what seems to happen with animals. To not show it, the second line here, the US alone trials, show the same recency to primacy shifts. So that's actually simple conditioning, and simple conditioning really isn't that simple. As I said, there are lots of variables that control it. What I want to do now is go into cue interaction, and this is a topic that was really tried to deal with in this soccer model that I published with Ralph Miller. And I'm not going to explain the model here because it's too complex to try to do in a short tutorial. But here's some of the phenomena that sort of cry out to be explained by formal models of conditioning. Let's say, now we're going to have to introduce some alphabet soup here. We're going to call the CS that we test X, and this is going to facilitate me putting some designs on the board. So we'll call that CS, that conditioned stimulus, a target stimulus. And we're going to ask a simple question. Does responding to a CS, a target CS, vary with treatment of other stimuli with which that cue was associated? The associate cue we're going to call CSA. Here's some different phenomena we can observe. Basic conditioning's at the top. This is acquisition. We pair X with the US. Real straightforward what Pavlov did. We observe pretty decent condition responding. I've represented that by a large CR. Next phenomena Pavlov also saw is called overshadowing. If you accompany X with another QA, so like tone and light predicting shock, you see that condition responding to the light is lower. Subjects seem to be confused or something, that if you have two cues predicting an outcome, you don't get very good responding to the one cue. Now we have something that Kamen showed in 68 or so, 67, blocking. Suppose that you first reinforce the A stimulus by following it with the US prior to the AX-US pairings, and now we test QX. We see extremely little responding to the cue. And so blocking, it seems like the subject, if you want to be mentalistic, the subject first learns that A predicts the US. There's no reason to really pay attention or to do anything, or let me just say, there's no reason to do anything with QX in this second phase. And another thing here, suppose you take this second phase and you knock off the US, and so blocking and one of the treatments for producing condition inhibition are the same, except that in these compound trials aren't reinforced. We'll actually see here A predicts the US, so the light predicts the shock. The combination of the light and the tone predict no shock. Subjects will actually respond in an inhibitory fashion to the tone. It becomes like a negative predictor. Now that's well-known stuff, cue competition. We can, if we want, and this is not the place for this, we can make a cue interaction matrix where we consider these compound trials. There are two cues that can either predict a CS or not. So they can be reinforced or not. That's one dimension. Another dimension, and these are orthogonal dimensions, is that the associate trials can be reinforced or not. And these associate trials can occur before, interspersed among, or after the compound trials. If you were to draw that, you would have a cue interaction matrix with a number of combinations. It would actually be a 2 by 2 by 3 matrix. There are 12 different cells. 3 of them don't make any sense because they involve non-reinforcement in both phases of the experiment. And a common observation when we look at experiments that come out of the cue competition or the cue interaction matrix is competition. It looks like to the extent that the subject responds to A, it responds less to X. The response potential of these two tend to be negatively correlated with each other. And that's observed even when the A trials occur after the AX trials. So let's go back to the same slide I had before. And this is a phenomenon that's garnered a lot of attention in the 1990s called retrospective revaluation. Many, many papers in associative learning on retrospective revaluation. We have one group here in which X predicts the US. That's our basic acquisition group. Now we have an overshadowing group in which A is combined with another Q, and the combination of the two predicts the US. We test X, we find a small condition response. Now what happens if you extinguish the associate Q after the pairing of the A and X together with the US? So this normally would produce this here, this line I call RR, for retrospective revaluation. Normally that produces weak condition responding. However, if you extinguish the associate Q after the conditioning, responding to the target, it goes back to normal. It's as if you didn't do this overshadowing. It's as if it never occurred. And so the subject seems, in the language of associative learning, the subject has changed its mind about the meaning of the cue. It's retrospectively reevaluated X. And lots of different variations of this currently in the conditioning literature. Now, here's Bizarro Superman, for those of you who are Superman fans. And Bizarro Superman is the opposite of Superman. We see, unfortunately, in the basic conditioning literature, the phenomena of cue facilitation, where we have exactly the same experimental design that I showed you on the last slide, producing exactly the opposite effect. Phenomena of potentiation, which we see a lot in taste aversion research. You accompany a taste with an odor, and you find that the taste aversion is actually facilitated. In other words, the taste and the odor don't compete with each other, they facilitate each other. And then if you were to extinguish the odor, you would find that the taste aversion actually decreases. And so why we sometimes see competition and sometimes we see facilitation, that we don't exactly know. Another very interesting, here's an example of this actually. I was going to show you one variable that matters is how closely spaced the trials are. Here's two groups. One received overshadowing training, the other was a straight acquisition group. And they received the conditioning either in space trials or mass trials. If you look at the space trials, this is the gray bars here, you'll see what here, if you compare the overshadowing to the acquisition group, you see a typical overshadowing effect, less responding after overshadowing training than after straight acquisition. However, if we mass the trials, exactly the opposite occurs. We see a cue facilitation or potentiation effect. And so we're only beginning to know the variables that affect when we see either facilitation or competition. And now I'm getting close to the end here. One of the things that people are doing lots of research on now in associative learning are phenomena in which we put competition, we take one type of competition and mix it with another, and you would assume that you would see more competition, but in fact you see none. Let me walk through this example. This was started by an experiment by Ben Williams in 1996. This is an abbreviated version of it. These designs get very complex very quickly. And so I appreciate your patience in looking at this. I have at the top here an acquisition control group, good conditioning. There's an overshadowing group here that produces fairly weak conditioning. Here's a blocking group. We reinforce A before the AX-US pairings, and that produces particularly poor conditioning. And now, and this isn't what Williams did, but people have done this since him. Suppose that you overshadow in the first phase here the AQ with a really intense salient stimulus B. B can be anything. Okay? So it's otherwise the same as blocking. The only thing you do different is that in the first phase you overshadow QA. In that case, you see pretty strong conditioning. It's as if A never existed, and so it doesn't have the potential to interrupt conditioning to X here. Now, one of the strange things about this competition of competition phenomenon is that it depends on the current status of the cues. Miller and his colleagues have shown that if you extinguish B after all of this junk that you do here, that condition responding actually drops. If you were to extinguish A, condition responding would go up. And so it doesn't seem to be a phenomenon that has anything to do with learning. It has to do with the current value of the stimuli. And that's one of the things that the soccer model was attempting to address. Now, some counteraction effects that have been studied, and this is just a few in the literature, blocking and blocking, putting those together, you find out that the blocking disappears. Overshadowing of blocking. Overshadowing and the US pre-exposure effect cancel each other. Degraded contingency and overshadowing cancel each other. A moment ago, I showed that trial massing, which usually harms conditioning, kills overshadowing. Latent inhibition, or CS pre-exposure, and overshadowing cancel each other. And overtraining cancels blocking. So we don't always see cue competition. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. If we were to go into the future, I think what people are going to be doing is mixing up these different possibilities. There's competition and there's facilitation, so logically you have 4 possibilities. Competition of competition, facilitation of competition, competition of facilitation, and facilitation of facilitation. I think there are some examples in the literature of each one of these cells, but I don't think anyone has walked through this systematically. Now, importance of Pavlovian conditioning to behavior analysts, and I think this has been missed a bit. The only reason that people study dogs salivating or rats being fearful of tones and not drinking their water is not because they're intrinsically interested in those phenomena themselves. They're interested in what they represent. It's a way to get a handle on learning, on general principles. And I think one thing that I believe about this is that when you have operant conditioning, you have a discriminative stimulus in the presence of which a response leads to a reinforcer, it is possible that, or as we said before, it's always the case that the discriminative stimulus is going to be paired directly with a reinforcer, and you're going to get conditioned responding whether you like it or not, or whether you understand it or not. Anytime we're doing operant conditioning, we're going to get Pavlovian conditioning. And so it's crucial for operant psychologists to understand Pavlovian conditioning. Another thing that might be very useful for operant psychologists is that it's probably the case that discriminative stimuli obey the same rules of competition and facilitation that I've shown. In other words, if you were to make this substitution and say that the response reinforcer contingency itself can just be substituted for the US and go back to all of those designs, I bet you $1,000 that you would see all of those different phenomena in operant conditioning. You're going to see blocking, you're going to see overshadowing, you're going to see recovery from overshadowing, you're going to see potentiation. And so I think that this work probably has a lot to inform eventually operant psychology about stimulus control. Not that people haven't looked at stimulus control, but they tend to do it in a dimensional sense, like varying colors, varying the tone, the pitch of a sound, and the like. There's probably an awful lot in the Pavlovian conditioning literature to inform our understanding of operant stimulus control. Of course, there have been many purposeful applications of Pavlovian conditioning. Systematic desensitization is relatively famous. In chemotherapy, sometimes people, it's common now to use a maple flavor before having the chemo so that the conditioning actually occurs to that flavor rather than to the pizza that you had just before you came into treatment. And that keeps people's weight up. Drug ingestion cues, cues that involve the seeking and the ingestion of a drug tend to lead to craving, and withdrawal responses that keep drug-taking behavior going, and those can be extinguished through a basic Pavlovian extinction. And finally, there's excellent experimental control afforded by the study of Pavlovian conditioning. So I hope that as we move through time, that there's more and more interaction between the associative learning tradition and the behavior analysis people, both experimental analysts of behavior and applied behavior analysts. And thank you.